Dark Souls, a game that I'm sure needs no introduction. You know what it is, or have at least heard about it in one way or another. Since its release in September of 2011, the game has reached almost legendary status among gamers, with some going as far as to label it the hardest game of all time. I mean, what else is to be expected of a game that at one point was literally subtitled Prepare to Die? Over the years since, we have received not just one, but two sequels in the forms of Dark Souls 2 and 3, not to mention From Software's other IPs, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. Of course, I can't mention all of their Souls-like games without bringing up 2009's Demon Souls, Dark Souls' predecessor that laid the groundwork needed for Dark Souls to become what it has today. But it doesn't even stop there. Although From Software is taking a short break after the release of Elden Ring, there are still many developers releasing games labeled by the community as Souls-like. The term Souls-like is best defined in this Reddit post by Jay Schwiftian, which states that Souls-like can be broken down into three defining features: punishing but fair combat that is heavily skill and or execution based and less strategic or stat based, very extensive lore, backstory, and or setting, with a very minimalist plot or story, and the substantial freedom to choose the order of map exploration. I completely agree with these traits being the defining features of Souls-like games. However, I also believe a game does not have to abide by all three features for it to be considered Souls-like. Take for example a game like Sekiro, which is oozing with a Souls-like aura, but also has a fully fleshed out story that is told through dialogue and cutscenes. So, in my opinion, a Souls-like game must have at least one, but more likely two, of the before-mentioned defining features to be considered Souls-like. However, what happens when a game successfully manages to pull all three Souls-like defining features together into one game? Well, that's what I'll be talking about today, as I dissect the original Dark Souls and figure out what made this game the genre-defining behemoth that it has become known as. Just a few disclaimers before I get into this. As I stated before in the video, yes, I know that Demon Souls came out first, and was basically Dark Souls before Dark Souls. However, Demon Souls was released as a PlayStation 3 exclusive. Not to mention, it was released during a time when PlayStation was in last place in terms of sales during a console generation. To try and keep it short, Demon Souls didn't have nearly the reach that Dark Souls had at the time of release, and with complete and remastered editions of the game available on all platforms, Dark Souls' reach has only grown larger. This isn't to say that Demon Souls is bad by any means. In my opinion, it's a good game, and even does some things better than Dark Souls. However, it will continue to be the older brother stuck in its younger brother's shadow. Plus, in all honesty, although doing some things better than Dark Souls, it just didn't do an all-around as well job as Dark Souls. Secondly, the footage that you have and will be seeing throughout the video was recorded on PC and is the remastered edition of the game. Now, why would you buy the remastered edition of the game, even though you already own the Prepare to Die edition, you may ask? Well, the answer is, I like running the game above 30 FPS without requiring mods, and also not tanking FPS in Blighttown. That, and the OG Dark Souls multiplayer, had some of the worst multiplayer connectivity issues that have ever plagued the online gaming landscape. Finally, if you ended up at this video while looking for a review to see whether or not Dark Souls is worth playing, then you have come to the wrong place. This video will contain massive game spoilers in more ways than just story, and I at least recommend that you complete the game once before viewing this video. You should definitely try Dark Souls, however, be warned that it isn't for everyone. A good amount of players drop the game before they even beat the second boss, due to the increased difficulty curve towards the beginning of the game. Get past this point, and I can almost guarantee that you will have a much better grasp on the game and its controls than when you began. Anyway, let's get on with the video. First things first, let's get this out of the way. Dark Souls isn't the hardest game of all time. Well, at least not anymore. When Dark Souls was released in 2011, the only game that had done the whole action combat thing in the same way was Demon Souls, and as I explained earlier, Demon Souls' reach was very limited compared to the reach of Dark Souls. So at the time of release, the majority of players had never even heard of Demon Souls, and with such a different control scheme compared to other games of the time, this made Dark Souls a bit more difficult than the average RPG. The difficulty curve within the first 5 hours is extremely steep for new new players. And the issue with comparing Dark Souls' learning curve with the learning curve of other RPGs is that other RPGs' learning curves are usually based off of systems used to strengthen stats in one way or another, instead of Dark Souls' curve, which mostly comes from controls. For example, currently I'm playing through Dragon Quest XI, and when it comes to controls, the most you have to do is run around using both analog sticks and hit one button to interact with the world. However, in the game itself, there is a typical JRPG system of unlocking abilities and spells, upgrading gear, forging gear, managing materials, and managing party members, as well as much more. The difference between the system-based difficulty in Dragon Quest XI and the control-based difficulty in Dark Souls is that in a system-based difficulty, you can slowly learn how the system works over time, and in some cases, don't even have to use the system to its full potential to successfully finish the game. When it comes to a control-based difficulty, you have a bit of an issue. You can't just not learn how to use the roll feature in Dark Souls. In a control-based difficulty, you have to use the system to its fullest potential, and if you don't, you are making it far more difficult on yourself. Therefore, forcing the player to learn and adapt to the control scheme is what gives Dark Souls its initial massive learning curve. Eventually, after playing for somewhere around 5 hours, the player will begin to adapt and see the initial control-based difficulty disappear. However, right when the player begins to get a good grasp on the controls is when the exploration and boss fights begin to become much more difficult. This trend continues until the middle of the game when the boss difficulty begins to peak, at least for the base game, that is. But we will leave the DLC for later. The beauty of control-based difficulty is that, unlike system-based difficulty, where you can do anything within the system limitations, control-based difficulty completely relies on the player, meaning that if you get good enough, you could technically beat the game without ever leveling up and using your bare fists. This gives players the ability for absolute freedom when coming up with ideas for builds or challenges. Look anywhere on Twitch or YouTube and you can find many people that have beat the game in a million different ways, and it's all because the controls are made to be taken full advantage of. So the game isn't difficult then? Well, no. Dark Souls is definitely still a difficult game, even without the controls. Take for instance the boss fights, which can push you to your absolute limits mentally. Yeah, I'm looking at you, Ornstein and Smo. Or the curse system, which literally just cuts your health in half. Or how about you lose your souls if you die before claiming them again? I could go on all day about how this game is still difficult, without counting controls, but I think you get the point. The good thing is that since you'll be scared shitless about getting cursed or losing your souls, you'd be surprised how fast you'll develop a muscle memory for shit that is trying to screw you over in this game. And it just so happens that muscle memory is the end-all be-all of Dark Souls difficulty. Like I mentioned earlier, look on YouTube or Twitch and you will find a number of challenge runs of Dark Souls. Take for instance the Happy Hobbs no-hit run. If you think that he was able to pull this off on one of his first few tries, you would be insane. He spent countless hours, which amounted to months worth of streaming, playing the game in the exact same order and doing what is necessary for the run. If you watch his oldest attempts compared to his newest attempts, you can tell that the newest attempts look very similar. That's because at this point it has become muscle memory to him, and I would make the argument that his hands are just moving the same way every time without him thinking on it. Now, I'm not saying that all players have to develop a muscle memory to the extent of the Happy Hobbs no-hit run. However, muscle memory for dodging, parrying, blocking, and attacking is important in Dark Souls, and I would be surprised if an average player wouldn't have at least memorized the attack patterns of basic enemies by the end of their first run. So Dark Souls difficulty is based off of control difficulty and muscle memory, and if I master the controls and get down the muscle memory, then I'm good, right? No. What? There's a lot of bullshit in Dark Souls, as I'm sure that many of you have figured out by this point. Earlier in the video, I said that Dark Souls has a control-based difficulty, and when compared to a system-based difficulty, control-based difficulty gives the player more power and freedom to master the system. If you want to beat Dark Souls with only your fists and without leveling up, you can do it. And control-based difficulty works great for the single-player game. But when you take that system into multiplayer and combine it with an invasion mechanic, it can get really bad. And I mean really bad. We're talking giant dad levels of bad right now. I'm sure that many of you have stories about playing Dark Souls for the first time and being frustrated with the game, when all of a sudden, an invader pops up and completely bodies you. This has become a norm in Dark Souls, where high-level players will invade in low-level areas and feast on the newbies. And the bad part is that most new players don't really have a chance of winning. Since the difficulty is completely control-based, it makes the PvP scene a sight to behold in the game. Now, some of you are probably thinking that most people you play against in PvP are trash, and to that, I say, congratulations, you've truly mastered the game. Although PvP being a mixed bag of good and bad players, it has the potential to be the hardest part of the game for most players. In all honesty, however, I'm sad to admit that I've never really been a huge PvPer in Dark Souls, so I think I will leave this part up to discussion amongst yourselves in the comments. So, if you've made it this far, you might be asking, well, didn't you start off this section saying that Dark Souls isn't hard, but then went on talking about all the difficulties in the game? Yes, I did. However, I will still stand by the idea that Dark Souls isn't as hard as it once was. I say this because since 2011, when the game was released, we have received not just Dark Souls 2 and 3, but Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring as well. Each of these games, in some way, shape, or form, are harder than the original Dark Souls, and I would be surprised if anyone said otherwise. My proposal isn't exactly that Dark Souls isn't hard, but instead that Dark Souls isn't as hard as it was for gamers in 2011, because since then we have received more difficult Souls-like games. To be fair, Dark Souls is still a hard game. However, at this point, it is more like riding a bike with training wheels. It's getting you ready for when you can take off those training wheels. So with that, it is still viable to say that Dark Souls does abide by the Souls-like trait of punishing but fair combat that is heavily skill and or execution based and less strategic and or stat based. Yes, strategy and stats do matter somewhat, but the skill and execution of a player is what really matters in Dark Souls. Let's move away from the difficulty of the game and talk for a bit about the story and lore of Dark Souls. Do keep in mind that I will not talk about every little detail in the lore. If you are interested in Dark Souls' complete lore, then look into VadiVidya's channel as well as Epic Name Bro's Dark Souls playthrough, both of which will be linked in the description. Also, a lot of this is coming from my own memory, so if I manage to miss something you think is important, feel free to let me and everyone else know down below. When it comes to the story of Dark Souls, it is actually pretty simple. As the player, you are the chosen undead that must collect the souls of lords to rekindle the flame and allow the world to continue as it is, or let the flame fade and allow the world to plunge into darkness. In all honesty, that version of the story isn't even that stripped down, but I guess we can go a bit more in depth with the story. The player character, who I will be referring to as the chosen undead, starts their journey in the Northern Undead Asylum, rotting inside a cell, when a body containing the key to their cell door is dropped from the ceiling by an unknown knight. Using that key, the chosen undead is able to escape the cell and explore the asylum, till they find the same knight from before who has now been gravely injured. After talking to the knight, the chosen undead learns that his name is Oscar. Oscar explains that in his family there is a saying, that those who become undead are actually chosen, and that the chosen should venture to the land of ancient lords and ring the bell of awakening, and after doing so, all will be clear to the chosen. Oscar dies, and the chosen undead ventures forth to the land of ancient lords, known as Lordran. Once there, it is learned that there are actually two bells of awakening, one in the undead church and another in the depths of Blighttown. After both bells have been rung, the gates of Sen's fortress are opened to allow the chosen undead to enter the city of the gods, Anor Londo. However, before the chosen undead makes their way to Anor Londo, they stop by Firelink Shrine to find a primordial serpent by the name of Kingseeker Frampt. Frampt tells the chosen undead that they are to succeed the great Lord Gwyn by linking the fire and casting away the dark, and that to do so, they will need to travel to Anor Londo to retrieve the Lord Vessel. Once there, the chosen undead encounters one of the four great knights of Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, Dragonslayer Ornstein, and his companion, Smo. After a hard-fought battle, the chosen undead makes their way to the chamber of Guinevere, the Princess of Sunlight, where they are awarded with the Lord Vessel. After returning to Frampt, the chosen undead is taken on a journey to the altar where the Lord Vessel is to be placed. After placing the Lord Vessel on the altar, the chosen undead is informed that to achieve the fate of linking the fire, they are required to fill the Lord Vessel with powerful souls. The powerful souls that are required to satiate the Lord Vessel are those of Gravelord Nito, the Witch of Izalith, the Four Kings of New Londo, and Seath the Scaleless. From this point, the chosen undead picks and chooses which target to go after, and once they have retrieved all the powerful souls, feeds them to the Lord Vessel, revealing a path to the kiln of the first flame, where the chosen undead will have to face off against the remnants of Gwyn before either kindling the flame or allowing it to be extinguished. All in all, the story really isn't anything super complicated. I mean, I just summed it up in less than 500 words. Dark Souls' story serves the purpose of giving the player a chance to explore a world that is reaching its end. The story by itself is just used to pull the player in deeper and try to get them somewhat interested in what it once was. Well, yes, I did leave out a few details like that of Koth, and the side stories of characters such as Solaire and Siegmeyer, as well as not even mentioning many of the bosses. In all reality, they don't really add much to the main story of the game. Dark Souls' main game will take most players between 40 and 60 hours to complete on their first run, and most experienced players will still take around 20 hours. Considering that I just explained the whole story of Dark Souls in less than 5 minutes, it might seem kind of long for such a short story, to which I would say, don't forget about the lore. The deep lore of Dark Souls is what holds its story together, and gives it the depth that people remember it for. When people talk about the story of Dark Souls, they most likely are referring to the lore. To give some context to the story that I summarized earlier, let's talk about the intro cinematic. The intro cinematic gives the player more lore-heavy information than any item description or character dialogue in the entire game. Much of the information that the player will need to know to understand why things happen the way they do in-game can be found through this cinematic. The first thing that the cinematic tells the player is that in the Age of Ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog, a land of grey crags, arch trees, and everlasting dragons. From these lines alone, the player is told how the world was at the beginning, before any of the events that took place in or around the time of the game. But then there was fire, and with fire came disparity, heat and cold, life and death, and of course, light and dark. When fire arrived, it brought with it changes that the world had not seen up to this point. Those changes started with hot and cold, but eventually turned more drastically to life and death, as well as light and dark. Where the world before was simple and one-sided, now there is more than one side to the coin. Then from the dark they came, and found the souls of lords within the flames. The way that this is stated makes it seem as though all life came from the same state, which possibly could be pointing towards hollowed. Being hollowed in Dark Souls means that you have lost your humanity, so gaining a soul is like gaining humanity in a sense. At this time it seems that there were many that found souls. However, there are also special souls, which are referred to as souls of lords. Nito, the first of the dead, the Witch of Izalith and her daughters of chaos, Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight and his faithful knights, and the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten. These four characters found souls of lords, which are considered the most powerful of souls within the Dark Souls world. Now, in comparing this part of the cinematic with the story from before, there are three names that cross over with the story. Those names being Nito, the first of the dead, the Witch of Izalith, and Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight. Once again, we will save the furtive pygmy for later on in the video. However, the three names that are shown in the cinematic account for the souls that are needed to power the Lord Vessel. But in the case of Gwyn, we need the shards of his soul that he had given to both Seath the Scaleless and the Four Kings of New Londo. With the strength of lords, they challenged the dragons. Gwyn's mighty bolts peeled apart their stone scales. The witches weaved great firestorms. Nito unleashed a miasma of death and disease, and Seath the Scaleless betrayed his own, and the dragons were no more. In this part of the intro cinematic, we are told of how all those who possess the souls of lords came together to destroy the ancient threat of the everlasting dragons, and succeeded in doing so, as well as the help given to the lords by Seath the Scaleless, who helped destroy his own kind. This represents the end of an era, where the ancients no longer rule and the Age of Lords is on the horizon. Thus began the Age of Fire, but soon the flames will fade, and only dark will remain. Even now there are only embers, and man sees not light, but only endless nights. And amongst the living are seen carriers of the accursed dark sign. This final section of the cinematic sets the stage for the world that the player will now be exploring, an Age of Fire that has come close to its end. It also tells the player of those that have and carry the dark sign, a sign that symbolizes the accursed undead that has been reborn after death. Now that's only a 3.5-minute cinematic, and I was able to explain more from that than the entire story of the game. When it comes to lore, Dark Souls is one of the most lore-rich stories ever to be created. Any and every item in the game can be explored in detailed writing that will give you a snippet of lore regarding it. Every character that you meet along the journey will give you a small bit of dialogue that will help fill in gaps in the game's lore that you didn't even realize were there. And by hiding all these details of lore throughout the world and items, it gets players more invested in the world when they have to search every nook and cranny to learn more. When it comes to extensive lore, backstory, and/or setting, Dark Souls takes the cake from many other series that try to do similar things, and the only other games that really match it in this regard would be its sequels, as well as Bloodborne, Sekiro, and Elden Ring. From Software's way of getting players invested in the lore of a world so that they will care more about the minimalist story is something that not many storytellers are capable of, and Dark Souls was one of the first times that they brought this degree of perfection to the story and lore of a game world. Well, up to this point of the video, I've talked about the difficulty, story, and lore. You may be thinking that, yes, Dark Souls can be difficult, and it has a good story and lore, but what makes it the standout game of the series, and the genre-defining behemoth that you have touted it as? As stated at the beginning of the video, one of the key defining features of a Souls-like game is the substantial freedom to choose the order of map exploration. And to be brutally honest, not a single Souls-like game other than Dark Souls has come even close to achieving this goal, except for maybe Elden Ring. Of course, that's not to say map exploration is terrible in the other Souls games, however, it can't even hold a candle to Dark Souls' exploration depth, and here's why. To start off the exploration section of the video, I wanted to take some time and explore all the routes possible through the world from the start of the game. So, as stated earlier, Dark Souls starts in the Northern Undead Asylum. The player explores the small area, and after talking with Oscar, receives an Estus flask and a key to leave through the front door of the asylum. After the player defeats the asylum demon, they can then leave the asylum and will be taken to Firelink Shrine. I'm not going to include the Master Key because it adds a bunch more routes, plus this will already be confusing enough. Also because you can do similar things without it. Now, if the player didn't take the Master Key as a starting gift, then there are 2 routes they can take, with an extra third one that leads to a dead end for now. The first route would be the traditional way of going through Undeadburg to fight the Taurus demon. The second route would be to go through New Londo and open the Floodgate. And the third extra route would be to go down into the catacombs and fight Pinwheel to get the Rite of Kindling early. However, after killing Pinwheel, the player can only explore part of the Tomb of the Giants before they will be unable to go any further. Going back to the first route, after the player beats the Taurus demon in the Undeadburg, they can then advance into the Undead Parish. After finding the basement key, they can then make the decision between fighting the gargoyles in the Undead Parish and ringing the first bell of awakening, or they can use the basement key and go to the lower part of Undeadburg to fight the Capra demon. Or they can just say screw both of those ideas and go to the Darkroot Garden and fight the Moonlight Butterfly. If the player decides to go the route of Darkroot Garden and defeat the Moonlight Butterfly, it isn't over. They can then go back to the Blacksmith Andre and buy a key that will allow them to enter the extra part of the garden and fight Sif. But if instead the player decides to go the route of the Capra demon, after fighting it, the player can enter the Depths and fight the Gaping Dragon. And from there, they can enter Blighttown and fight Quelaag and ring the second bell of awakening. Now let's go back to the alternative route that can be taken from Firelink by way of New Londo. First, you have to go into the New Londo ruins and make your way to Ingward. After killing him, you can take a key off his body, allowing you to open the floodgates. After the floodgate is opened, the player can run across the bridge in the Valley of the Drakes and take the elevator up to the Darkroot Basin, or go the opposite direction to Blighttown. If the player goes up to the Darkroot Basin, they can then choose to do anything that Route 1 had the ability to do, plus the ability to fight the 4 kings of New Londo early in the game. The player also has the option to take the much easier backdoor into Blighttown to fight Quelaag. After defeating Quelaag, the player has the choice of fighting the Ceaseless Discharge now or later, but that is up to them. No matter what, the player will ring both bells of awakening, then the entrance to Sen's Fortress will be opened. After fighting the Iron Golem, they can then go to Anor Londo and fight Ornstein and Smo. After defeating them, the game opens back up again and lets the player explore 3 areas that were sealed off before, those being the rest of the Tomb of the Giants, the Demon Ruins plus Los Izalith, and the Duke's Archive. There are also a couple of hidden areas that can be accessed, those being the Painted World of Ariamis, as well as the Great Hollow, and of course, Ash Lake. Dark Souls leaves it almost completely up to the player to explore the world and find out how they want to traverse its levels. One reason why it works so well is due to the fact that teleporting is disabled for the first half of the game. In Dark Souls 2 and 3, the player has the opportunity to warp to any bonfire location almost right away. This takes away from the exploration, and also means that the devs don't have to keep the world super connected, because after the first time, people won't have to explore it again. In Dark Souls, the lack of teleportation till the second half of the game forces the player to explore the world, unlock shortcuts, and find every hidden path. And because there was no teleportation during the first half of the game, it forced them to make a world that is super connected. Like the first time that you get to the undead church and take the elevator only to learn that just below you is the Firelink shrine that you thought you had traveled so far from. Or when you ring the Bell of Awakening in Blighttown and take the back door into New Londo, only to find that the elevator leads you back to the Firelink shrine. Sadly, this idea of exploration does not extend throughout the whole game, but it works amazingly for the first half. After the Ornstein and Smo fight, the game takes a drastic dip in quality, with some areas being a complete mess. Yes, I'm looking at you, Lost Izalith. Even the final area, the Kiln of the First Flame, and the final boss, Gwyn the Lord of Sunlight, aren't exactly what they could have been or what people expected. But even with all of these glaring issues towards the end of the game, Dark Souls still stands far above its siblings in terms of map exploration and connection. When looking through the whole game, the only times that you really have to sit through a whole loading screen or teleport would be when you go to or from Anor Londo, to or from the Painted World of Ariamis, back from the Abyss, or to the DLC area. Besides these limited instances, you could easily play the game without ever teleporting anywhere. But I think at this point, you've listened to me enough on the topic of map exploration. Is it perfect? No. Is it the best in the series? Yes. End of discussion. Fight me in the comments. When it comes to side stories in Dark Souls, most would probably think of characters like Solaire or Siegmeyer, who, well yes, are fan-favorite characters, don't really bring much in terms of depth to the overall story. However, there is one side story that makes Dark Souls' lackluster endgame something else entirely, and I am of course talking about the Dark Souls Artorias of the Abyss expansion. Although not having perfect world interconnectivity, the expansion did excel in the areas of story, lore, and also difficulty. And let me tell you, adding more to the already good story and lore, plus making the game more difficult after the lackluster fights that most of the final bosses gave to the players, it was pretty good. The expansion is definitely a highlight from the game, but let's discuss a bit more in detail what made this expansion most definitely the best all-around part of the game. While playing through the base game of Dark Souls, the player will most likely encounter a large Hydra in the Darkroot Basin. After defeating the beast, if the player follows the left side of the cliffs, they will find a cave with a golden golem inside. After defeating the golem, they will be greeted with a woman named Dusk of Ulasil, who will thank you for freeing her, then teleport away, telling you that if you ever need her, just summon her. When the player returns to the spot where they fought the Hydra, they will find a summon sign for Dusk. When summoned, she will sell the player Ulasil spells, which are designed for civilian use since Ulasil is an old kingdom of magic users. So then the player will continue on their journey till they find the broken pendant in the Duke's archives. When reading the pendant's item description, it states that it originates from Ulasil, so naturally the player goes to ask Dusk about it. However, Dusk's summon sign is unavailable. If the player ventures to the cave where they found Dusk, instead there is now a weird glowing portal. When the player reaches out to touch it, a giant hand reaches out, grabs the player and pulls them in. When the player comes to, they have been transported to somewhere that feels familiar, but they aren't certain. After fighting the Sanctuary Guardian, the player talks to the mushroom woman Elizabeth, and it is here that the player is told the whole story. Basically, some sort of ancient raging evil has created an abyss that will grow and devour everything, and that Artorias, one of the 4 great knights of Gwyn, has come to defeat the great evil. Throughout the base game, the player continues to find information about a knight by the name of Artorias, Artorias the Abyss Walker, and the player even gets to fight his sidekick, the Great Grey Wolf Sif. It was said that Artorias successfully stopped the advance of the Abyss hundreds of years ago, then disappeared. So now that the player has heard about the Abyss and Artorias, they know that they have been taken back to that very time in history. After exploring the surrounding area, the player learns that Ulasil is located exactly where the events of Dark Souls take place hundreds of years later. However, after exploring a bit further, the player finds the horror that has become of Artorias the Abyss Walker. Now corrupted and broken by the Abyss, the player is forced to put him down. But if Artorias dies, then how is he supposed to stop the Abyss's never-ending expansion? He never did. The player travels back in time and stops the Abyss from spreading, and people just think that it was Artorias the Abyss Walker. This expansion takes an epic story that the player has heard throughout the base game and basically says, yeah, that was actually you. Because of this expansion, Artorias has become a fan favorite along with the goodest boy of them all, Sif. The rest of the expansion is spent meeting other famous characters, such as Lord's Blade Kieran and Hawkeye Gaw, the two final to be introduced of the four Knights of Gwyn, as well as the big baddie of the expansion, Manus, Father of the Abyss, who might possibly be the furtive pygmy mentioned in the opening cinematic of the game, but I'll leave that up to you. However, even with all these famous characters, they definitely didn't let difficulty fall by the wayside. Manus is touted for having the most health out of all the bosses in the game, while also having some of the longest combo attacks in Dark Souls. But don't forget about Artorias, who is fast and deadly, and Black Dragon Calamide is no pushover either. Not to forget the before mentioned Sanctuary Guardian. This expansion brought with it difficult bosses and areas, good story and expanded lore, as well as good exploration. This expansion is a bow on top of an already good game, and this expansion is part of the reason that Dark Souls is as remembered as it is. So now that I've talked your ear off, I hope that you have at least realized that when I say Dark Souls is the best Souls-like game out there, I mean it. Although falling short in a couple of spots, the game is almost perfect, and of course does exploration freedom better than any other game in the series. All of the factors that I have discussed in this video help to contribute to the idea that Dark Souls is already a classic, as well as a genre-defining behemoth that still as of yet is the best all-around Souls-like game out there. If you disagree with me, you're wrong. Just kidding. But in all seriousness, let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you have made it to this point in the video, then thank you. I put a lot of work into creating this video and really hope that you enjoyed it. Anyway, my name is Dawson, also known as Boff on the internet, and if you enjoyed, please like the video and subscribe. See you next time.